our next section is going to talk about schizophrenia. Now, schizophrenia is a psychological disorder that is common enough that it kind of falls under its own category. And so when we're talking about the name schizophrenia, it actually means split mind. So schizo meaning separated and phrenia meaning of the mind. So when we're talking about characteristics of schizophrenia, we tend to see disordered patterns in terms of severe disturbances in thinking, which might include delusions. And delusions are false beliefs. So you might see in the media where people talk about, oh, this person is schizophrenia. They are concerned that the CIA is out to get them. That would be a delusion. We also see disturbances in their speech. So a lot of individuals with schizophrenia have disorganized speech patterns or use strange words, talk in a strange way. We also see issues with perception. So some, but not all, most, but not all, individuals with schizophrenia experience hallucinations. So some form of either auditory or visual hallucinations. And a hallucination is just a false perception. Basically where you're perceiving something without there being a physical stimulus for you to be detecting. So you're seeing things without there being actual light reaching your eyes to tell your brain that that's a thing that you should be seeing. We also have issues with emotion. So some individuals with schizophrenia will have what's called a blunted affect, maybe where they're a little bit removed from the world. Maybe they're not responding to things in their environment. Or you might see an inappropriate effect where maybe you're supposed to be in a very serious situation, but they find it funny. Or there's something funny going on, but they find it serious. So it's an inappropriate emotional response given the situation. And of course, you run into issues with behavior, sort of moving around too much or too little, acting on these inappropriate effects and emotions, responding to things that aren't there in terms of hallucinations, lots of different behavioral indicators. Now, a lot of individuals will talk about subtypes of schizophrenia. And in the DSM-4, they did break schizophrenia down into different subtypes. So paranoid, disorganized, catatonic, undifferentiated, and others. But the DSM-5 doesn't make this distinction any longer. They still exist, they're just not divided up the same way, which we'll come to in just a second. But for these DSM-4 divisions, someone who is a paranoid schizophrenic, someone with paranoid schizophrenia, they might have delusions of persecution or delusions of grandeur. That idea of the CIA is out to get me, or I'm a very important person and everybody knows who I am, that falls under that umbrella of paranoid schizophrenia. An individual with disorganized schizophrenia, they have more of those disorganized and sort of chaotic traits. They display confusion, inability to form cohesive thoughts, incoherence, so they can't form words, again, sort of scattered. For catatonic schizophrenia, you're going to have severe motor disturbances, but not in the way that you usually visualize when you think of schizophrenia. When we think of schizophrenia, we tend to think of people who are moving too much, who are moving in very unpredictable manners. But someone with catatonic schizophrenia actually ends up freezing up. And there are cases of people with this catatonic schizophrenia becoming almost like statues, where you can pose them and get them to hold very unnatural poses, and they don't move. Once they've been put in that position, they will stand very, very still until they come out of that catatonic state. And then we can also have undifferentiated schizophrenia. And that's basically the fancy way of saying that it doesn't fall under any of these categories. So it could be someone who has symptoms that fall under multiple categories, or symptoms that don't quite fall into any categories. That's where we get the undifferentiated schizophrenia. So, like I said, not everybody uses these subtypes of schizophrenia. Some individuals, especially a lot of health practitioners, prefer to use the type 1 versus type 2 subdivision of schizophrenia. So, type 1 schizophrenia basically focuses on individuals that mostly suffer from positive symptoms. So, we're going to be talking about positive symptoms with type 1 and negative symptoms for type 2. But basically, positive symptoms are going to be an overabundance of a particular thing. So these are going to be people who are experiencing delusions and hallucinations and that disordered speech and thought, where they are seeing things that aren't there. There's more that they're perceiving than what they should be. Disordered speech, they're talking more than they should be. They're having excessive thoughts, lots of movement, delusions. So lots of extremes. So a lot is happening, and those are the positive symptoms. For negative symptoms in type 2 schizophrenia, that's when you have a loss of things. So you kind of have an absence of normal reactions. So instead of the too much of positive symptoms, you run into not enough with these negative symptoms. So you see a lack of emotion, a lack of expression, a lack of motivation. So they end up not doing many things. So for type 1, there's sort of too much energy, too much going on, too many actions, and type 1 is not enough of any of it. And when we look at the difference between those two different types, individuals that have these negative symptoms, they tend to have a long history of poor functioning. So if they have these negative symptoms, it tends to be an ongoing thing, and it tends to negatively impact their lives. So it's really hard to live on your own, to take care of yourself when you have these negative symptoms, because scroll back, you don't have motivation, you lose expression, you lose emotion, maybe you lose the ability to move the way that you. So it's very hard to be high functioning with negative symptoms. And because of this, there's a really poor recovery and really poor functionality with it. And individuals with negative symptoms are a lot less likely to return to normal functionality. Individuals with positive symptoms tend to have a good history, or a history of good functioning and better prognosis in the long run. So as much as these positive symptoms can be disruptive and intense at that time, in the long run, people with positive symptoms tend to recover and get back to at least fairly normal functioning, at least a lot more than people with negative symptoms. So it is quite a bit better statistically to have the positive symptoms in terms of long term. Now, from the pattern of this chapter, we can talk about different factors that influence whether or not you have schizophrenia. And as you might expect, there are intense genetic factors that are involved. Again, there is no gene that directly links to schizophrenia, but we do see from twin studies, from adoption studies, from all sorts of different tests and studies, there is a strong genetic component. So that higher concordance rate between twins that are more closely related. So you see a very high concordance rate between identical twins or monozygotic twins, and a slightly less high concordance rate between dizygotic or fraternal twins. So the more closely genetically related you are, the more likely you are both to have the disorder. Now, there are also associations between brain abnormalities and developing schizophrenia. And there's a specific hypothesis, this neurodegenerative hypothesis, that states that as neural tissue is destroyed or as it atrophies, you start seeing a higher incidence of schizophrenia. So individuals who have schizophrenia have more brain damage in certain areas than people who don't have schizophrenia. And we can actually look at this diagram here, which is showing. So here on the left, we have individuals that have schizophrenia, and on the right, we have individuals that don't have schizophrenia. And for those that do have schizophrenia, we see enlarged ventricles, these sort of butterfly-ish shapes in the middle here. So in patients with schizophrenia, those areas are larger than in those who don't have it. So that part of the brain may somehow be related to developing schizophrenia. Another fairly promising and widely accepted idea is the dopamine hypothesis. And so the idea here is that overproduction of dopamine, or this overactivity in the dopamine system, so whether it be production of dopamine or oversensitivity in the receptors that pick up dopamine, or even a slow cleanup of dopamine after it's been released, some kind of overactivity of dopamine in the brain might be associated with schizophrenia. So dopamine is involved in regulating our emotions and our motivation and our cognitive functioning. So having high levels of dopamine can throw those things off. And coincidentally, some of the antipsychotic drugs that are really effective at treating schizophrenia, they do so by reducing dopamine activity. So if they reduce that activity or that functionality of dopamine, then it helps reduce schizophrenia symptoms. So this is another one of those where if you have a little bit of time to look into the dopamine hypothesis, this is a weird one because they think that this is what's going on, but they're not quite sure why. It's a little bit more complicated as you delve into it. I spent a lot of time talking about this one in my third year course, but maybe you'll get to that one at some point. And of course, we can talk some more about Freud because he really liked these psychological disorders. And as per usual, we're using Freud as the idea that his theories sparked interest and got debate going in the field, but they aren't generally accepted nowadays. But his idea was that schizophrenia was a very extreme employment of the defense mechanism of regression. The idea that these individuals are retreating to an earlier, more secure stage in their lives. So their disordered thoughts and odd behaviors were them retreating to a childlike state in their lives. So, of course, there really isn't any evidence for this at all, though we do know that there is some sort of relation to stress that might theoretically trigger defense mechanisms, but that's not the whole picture. So, again, take the Freud stuff with a grain of salt. On the cognitive side of things, the theory is that schizophrenia involves sort of a deficit in their ability to filter different stimuli from the environment. So individuals who have schizophrenia have a hard time filtering out irrelevant information. So if you think about it, in our environment, we're surrounded by all sorts of signals. There's sounds, there's smells, there's textures, there's all sorts of things that you could be paying attention to. But a normal, healthy brain filters out most of those aspects. You're not necessarily aware of the feeling of your clothes until I draw your attention to it. Maybe you can pay more attention to the shape of your screen or dust on your screen, or maybe your computer makes a sound or whatever. All of those are external and irrelevant stimuli that you can pay attention to if you want to or if you're forced to, but for the most part, you filter them out. So the idea is that someone with schizophrenia can't filter out that extra information and is therefore surrounded by overwhelming amounts of information all the time. And so that might be causing, or at least driving, some of the symptoms that were observed. If we want to talk about environmental factors, there's a strong correlation between having more stressful life events and being more likely to develop schizophrenia. So maybe leading back to that diathesis stress model again, where the more stress from your environment that you're experiencing, the more prone you are to developing that disorder. And of course, in terms of environment, your family dynamics matter intensely. So what kind of environment did you grow up in? How were your parents? What parenting style did you have? Those sorts of things. Of course, our vulnerability factors from that diathesis stress model again. Do you have a predisposition from your genetics? Do you have a predisposition from lacking a support system? Different kinds of reactions that you're getting in your life, your day-to-day life. So a couple of different environmental contributions. And these points here, when we start talking about expressed emotion, there have been a couple of studies that have found a link not with the first occurrence of symptoms of schizophrenia, but of reoccurrence of symptoms of schizophrenia. So the idea here is that individuals who score high in expressed emotion after having been treated for schizophrenia at least once, if they returned to a home environment that had high levels of criticism, high levels of hostility, or where those family members are over-involved in that individual's life, they were at much higher risk for having recurring schizophrenia symptoms. So these expressed emotions, these high levels of sort of negative traits, can lead to more cases of schizophrenia happening again, or having to be re-hospitalized or retreated for those same symptoms. And of course, we're going to talk about sociocultural factors. In this case, we're going to talk specifically about two different hypotheses that help explain the fact that schizophrenia is a lot more common in lower socioeconomic populations. So individuals that don't have as high of an income tend to be more prone to schizophrenia. So the two potential explanations for this are our social causation hypothesis. So the idea that higher levels of stress among low-income individuals, that's additional environmental stress that is adding to your likelihood of developing schizophrenia. So by having higher levels of stress, you're more likely to sort of tip over that point with that diathesis stress model into developing schizophrenia. The other side of this is the social drift hypothesis. And this says that your low social economic status doesn't predispose you to schizophrenia. It says instead that your schizophrenia maybe predisposes you to becoming low income. So the idea is that as your functioning deteriorates, as the symptoms of schizophrenia get more intense, you tend to be less able to support yourself. So you would drift downward in that socioeconomic ladder. So your income becomes less as your functioning becomes less. And so, of course, we can't make people low income or make people have schizophrenia. So it's really hard to differentiate between these two. But these are two opposing hypotheses that might explain what's going on.